less than 2,000.
The podcast.
All right, man. So I think we're in a little over our heads here. I think we might want to bring in some reinforcements for this topic.
Why do you say that?
I don't know. It's just kind of older stuff that's not necessarily directly in our wheelhouse.
Well, I guess it's not really directly in our wheelhouse, but I mean, you've seen a lot of these films. You've seen Jaws, you've seen Star Wars, you've seen Taxi Driver, you've seen tons of these movies.
Absolutely, I've seen these things, and I am an expert in them, but let's just raise the level of our discussion by bringing in somebody who's really intelligent and can really just raise the level of discourse on this show.
I think we should bring on my friend Roland, who's a film connoisseur.
We are good on all fronts, except for the fact that we've got Roland as our guest today.
Oh, that's except the fact.
Yeah.
Scraping the bottom of the barrel, man. I'm happy to be here.
Roland Manarin joins us today. He is an expert. He's a cinephile. He is a film guru that we decided to bring on to give us some, and he's also a lot older than us. He's a good 6 years older than us. So we thought we'd bring him in to talk about today's topic, which is like 70s movies, 70s blockbusters, and how it influenced our cinema today. Roland Manarin, thanks for joining us.
Anytime, guys. Happy to be here.
So I was getting ready. I was preparing for today, and I had this realization that hit me. I'm really excited about today because both of you have greatly influenced my career. Adam, when I was 10, got me into theater and writing and got me into the arts. And then 10 years later, Roland is the guy who actually introduced me to the world of production and got me actually making and helping and assisting on projects. So I have you two to thank for a lot of my career. And so you're both here today, and that's really exciting.
That's awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome, Chad. You're welcome for giving you a career.
Now we know who the troll is. The one guy says, "You're welcome." The other guy goes, "Oh, thank you." I've heard stories that Jaws was so behind, so over budget, so terrible that the studio actually sat Spielberg down and said, "Okay, it's going to be okay if you want to pull the plug." And he was like, "No, we're getting through this thing." That movie was a production train wreck. And then it becomes what officially starts what is now the American blockbuster.
Right? It's interesting how a lot of those things start, because what we're doing, pretty much all film is kind of a series of happy accidents. It's a writer coming up with a great idea, and then all of a sudden, somebody else thinks that's a great idea, and they throw money at it until it just explodes and it gathers people. And suddenly, someone's like, "Hey, I know you really wanted to make a giant shark, but now we don't have one. What do you think about like a gazelle?" What? Okay. I mean, that's what we got the money for. And suddenly, it's an attack of the giant gazelle or whatever. And most of the time that usually turns up being bad, but every once in a while, they do something magical with that lack of what they wanted, and it turns into an iconic moment, and that iconic moment is what we again sit around and talk about, and that's the thing that sticks with us over our memory. So yes, exactly. If Jaws hadn't had the budgetary issues that it had, it wouldn't have been so creative to really kind of make it scary. Like in Jaws, the whole not really seeing the shark and the music we associate more than the visuals. And that's because they just didn't have enough money, and they had this animatronic shark that most of the time looked really bad and unbelievable. So they hid it. I mean, it was gonna be all over the place in that movie. You were gonna see it everywhere, and it was just instead, because it was an unrealistic shark, they didn't have the money to make it look right. Boom! Suddenly we get this creeping fear of this thing hunting us, unseen monster, and that wasn't even part of the plan. And that's how it became so amazing, because they simply didn't have it. It was kind of a mistake, if you will. And that's one of the beautiful things about film, in my opinion.
A happy accident, Bob Ross happy accident, if you will.
Oh, the guy was on it. He knew.
There are no mistakes, only happy accidents. Now, let me take a step back and say, I thought this show was about the 80s and 90s. What are we doing talking about Jaws and stuff from the 70s, Chad?
Trying to appeal to a wider audience base. No, actually, no. In all seriousness, film expands, and develops and morphs. It's kind of like the Matrix changed cinema for like almost a decade. I think it's important to go back and really where this came from is I was sitting here going, wait a minute, Jaws came out in 1975, Steven Spielberg, Scorsese's, I think, second film was Taxi Driver, but that was his biggest film at the time. And then you had, Lucas, who did Star Wars in 1977. I was thinking how mind-blowing that the artists that we still revere today all had essentially breakout hits within 3 years of each other.
Well, another way to say it is you don't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. And if we're going to talk about 80s and 90s, like what we think of as film really began in the 70s. Really, the late 60s, and we'll do a separate episode on the late 60s with, things like Midnight Cowboy, Easy Rider, 2001, The Graduate, and so on. That's where cinema really started changing, because before the late 60s and those types of films we were talking about, it was Hitchcock and Kurosawa. I mean, wouldn't you say, Roland? That was pretty much it in terms of quality, different directing. Hitchcock and Kurosawa, and everything else was just all the same. Film's
weird in the fact that it's very much like an iceberg, and your perspective is always standing on top of it. So what you're standing on is current time. So you look around and you see it, and it's amazing because it has kind of grown and evolved with you. You've adapted to that situation, right? This is what you want. You look at it. I mean, watching a random 60s movie and watching a random movie today, most people are going to prefer the movies today because they're kind of tailored specifically for us and our environment and everything. But the lower you go down into that ice, you can kind of look down and go, oh, okay, well, here's 70s and 80s movies I grew up with, and then now you got movies that happened before you were born, and then you keep going back. But I mean, when I was studying film history, like one of my favorite movies of all time are really old, which is kind of strange. But there's two of them, La Jetée, which they got remade into 12 Monkeys today, which is fantastic.
Fantastic.
And it was a French film of all things, so it couldn't have been farther away from my wheelhouse, but it's utterly brilliant and in so many ways even better than 12 Monkeys. And you can go all the way back to, because I'm a huge sci-fi nerd, so I like Metropolis. Now, Metropolis was one of the first major science fiction, the first, let's be honest, science fiction movie, and it's utterly brilliant, and we're still stealing from it today. And I think it's brilliant. So yeah, unfortunately, your foundation of film goes back as far as you're allowing yourself to accept it. Come on, Kurosawa, you can watch those movies today and still go, wow, that's brilliant, and even take inspiration directly from that, while you might take something today and watch it and go, I totally forgot what I just watched. So sometimes that brilliance goes along with the people, like with the directors, the producers, and even the writers. That inspiration can come all the way back, and sometimes you just got garbage, which we have a lot of garbage today.
We have a ton of garbage today.
Let's go all the way back. I mean, So Jaws is widely considered to be, whether it's true or not, widely considered to be the, quote, first blockbuster, the big first summer blockbuster, popcorn flick type that we're talking about here, the Spielbergian style. But going all the way back into ancient film history, I mean, where do you think that, do you think there's anything before that? We talked about Triumph of the Will. We talked about Gone with the Wind. We talked about Birth of a Nation. Do you think there's anything before Jaws that I listed or otherwise that would be the first blockbuster?
Charlie Chaplin. Just not in the 70s. But yes. Well, so some of the first film ever was a train. They filmed a train coming right at it. And it scared people so bad they fell out of their seats.
Right.
Because there's always that, it's always, and we have to look at it now and we would be like, that's pedestrian. But back then, that was scary.
Yeah, they were running from the theater thinking the train was going to smash
because it was so real. And then immediately, the next thing they filmed was porn.
Right.
Because it was so realistic. They were like, well, that's what we want. We don't want to get hit by a train. That's the evolution of it. You always still have to look at history. So at that point in history, that was the first things that they were able to shoot. They were able to present it, and it was a picture, a magic picture. And now, you know what I mean? We're sitting there going, we could do 3D headsets where we can almost be in the movie. I mean, it would be better than Atari graphics at this point. But I mean, they're getting to that point where where pretty soon they're just going to fool you. The Mandalorian right now, and I'm just going to point this out, even though it's not relevant to what we're talking about, but I think it's interesting. So the Mandalorian made this circle room, and instead of using green screen, they're basically just using images now. The actors can actually look around and see those things, and they're shooting just a computer screen that's behind them. So they can put whatever they damn well want to in that computer screen, but it gives you realistic lighting. It gives you the actors the ability to play off the location instead of it just being like a giant blue screen. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a pin in it and mark it as this is another one of those moments in history, film history, that we are living in, that we are completely oblivious to, that is going to change everything we see and hear about film. So I just want to mark it, since we're recording this for prosperity, that moment's going to change everything, because it's going to start letting 3D pictures happen a lot easier. It's going to start allowing for virtual reality stuff a lot easier, and just honestly getting rid of old blue screen and allowing things to be more realistic and ultimately cheaper. So just watch that.
I miss the 80s and 90s.
Getting back to the question. Okay, so King Kong was like 1930 something, right? I mean, that was a blockbuster, if you will. The stop motion animation, the blue screen kind of stuff that they did, or however they did those effects, the claymation and all of that, just groundbreaking cinematography at the time. I think saying that Jaws was the first summer blockbuster kind of sells cinema history short.
I would agree with that statement 100%. Modern, how we view them today, though, it had that feel, it definitely had that thing, because Jaws is weird. So like if you go to Alien, Alien is more of a horror film. Mm-hmm. Okay. But then when you get to Jaws, like I never really saw Jaws as a horror film. It has this kind of fun, interesting element to it, something that Alien really didn't have. Alien might jump you out of your seat, it might do whatever, and sure, Jaws might do that too, but they felt distinctly different. And I know one's in space and one's about a shark, but they're still about being hunted by something that is out of your control, beyond your understanding, and its power level is significantly greater, and you can't see it most of the time. So both of those had very distinct things, but the feel is what I think is very relevant. When you watch Jaws, you're jamming the popcorn in your mouth, you're scaring next to your friend. But like with Alien, it was like a deeper feeling. And I think that connection, because before then horror was always kind of like, out of your seat kind of a thing. And it was more of a deeper inside, like you were saying earlier, almost like more cerebral fear. And this was more of a jump out of your seat, laugh kind of fun feel. And that's kind of how the popcorn movie became, because it became wider for more audiences. So people can watch Jaws that weren't really into horror films and still kind of enjoy themselves, while people who would watch Alien might not enjoy Alien for the different reasons, because it might have been either too scary or a little bit too, I don't know, realistic maybe.
Yeah, I mean, well, Jaws is dubbed a thriller. I mean, it's not a horror film.
But it is about a giant thing eating everyone else. You could absolutely classify it as a horror film, and I think that's the distinct difference between the two. A pitch meeting, both of them come off as a horror movie, but once you've shot it and you've seen it, you're correct. One's a thriller, and one is a horror movie, and I think that's your difference right there. Stanley
Kubrick, my favorite director, Stanley and David Lynch. Those are the two guys. I don't think it's possible to. Well, first of all, you know how good Stanley is by how much of his stuff is referenced in pop culture and in other movies, and like specifically The Simpsons. Think about how many times The Simpsons has sent up something of Stanley's. Stanley, in his career, in his innovation of adding to the blockbuster legacy, I mean, he took over Spartacus, pissed off Kirk Douglas, so they got to bring Stanley in, and that was the last time Stanley ever had to answer to anybody ever. Like, he was beholden to the studio because he was working on somebody's project. After that, he became the dictator from How I Learned to Love the Bomb, to Dr. Strangelove through the end of his career with Eyes Wide Shut, and he had complete control over the script and the vision of the film, and because of that, he made some stuff that would never have flown in a democracy type situation. If a studio was designing a film, 2001 would not be it. You know, A Clockwork Orange would not be a film that's designed by a studio. There's a open forum for you to talk about Stanley and his influence on cinema.
And they're fantastic. But I think you made a point there too, that film is a collaborative art, but it must be focused. And it must be focused from a certain point. So when you have a studio and you have, say, a bunch of investors, the more hands you start getting in control of that pie, the more, well, I'm not going to say exclusively, but I would say the chances of your film or project kind of losing its way or petering out and becoming average increases. When you have a singular vision, and then that vision, you find other people that agree with that vision, then it just works better. Is the director the be-all most important part? No, I think everybody is the most important part because it is truly collaborative, but their job is to funnel everybody into the same vision, even if that vision isn't their own. And sometimes it's like Kubrick where it's all his, but I mean, you got to remember that the scripts and stuff weren't Kubrick's.
Well, Arthur C. Clarke wrote the book, and
right, and you got things like The Shining, where
Stephen King.
You got Stephen King. What are you going to do? But
everything he ever did was adapted. Everything he ever did was adapted.
So they were never his visions, but he was the one funneling that vision into the way that he saw it, and that's important.
You're right. Okay, so. Just to put this blockbuster discussion in a little bit of context.
Look, the weird thing is like, okay, so most film and any kind of entertainment, from books, television, everything, is always going to go along with what the masses want. And it's always going to cater to them because it's always a business. It's always going to be a business. And you need to feed your family. So you're going to give people what they want to buy. And that's the general feeling. But then every once in a while, there's always a break. And you can see this in everything. So there's this break where suddenly someone says, you know what? I don't think this is what everybody wants to see. I think people are tired of it. I think they're ready for this next thing. And then they present it. And sometimes no one cares. It's forgotten. It's missed. And then other times.
Well, hold on. But the reason why no one cares is because all of that copying of similar like-minded, films, that's because after somebody had success, studios just jump in and want to like mass churn out that stuff to get as much revenue. So the only people that are going to stand out are the original filmmakers of that genre, of that film.
The other thing I'm kind of alluding to, or I want to toss into this conversation that we can kind of stir up with it, is cult classics. So cult classics are the ones that are ahead of their time, and these cult classics often influence the person who makes that spark that changes the entire consciousness or subconsciousness, if you will. And those things are really important. You're going to have those all over the place, where they started out as being terrible and no one liked them. Like, it's the one that popped into my head, Big Trouble in Little China. Yes, I know it's not exactly time frame relevant, but nobody really cared for that movie all that much. Everyone liked The Golden Child and stuff like that a little bit better. And then all of a sudden, nowadays, most people know about that movie. And a lot of influences have been pulled directly from that movie. And I think the cult classics are important to add into this because they're that almost spark. They're like the little spark that didn't catch. And then eventually you're almost always going to see the spark happen shortly after the cult classics of that genre, which are always interesting and I think relevant to what we're talking about here, because those are often the ones that are forgotten about.
I mean, didn't Fight Club sort of fall into that?
Yeah,
and that kind of fell into the same thing.
It didn't really do all that well.
No, it didn't. It was a commercial failure, it domestically, internationally, but it became a cult classic and has influenced a generation of filmmakers and story writers.
And a generation of people who didn't really understand the movie, funny enough.
Sure. True.
People forget Tyler is not the hero of that movie. He's actually not what is supposed to be the one. So he's charismatic, he's fun, he's cool, he's handsome, he's built, he's buff, he's got the right thing to say at the right time, and he is not the hero. And it's a very quick little changeroo and switcheroo that a lot of filmmakers do. And that's one of the reasons why I think Fight Club's so brilliant, because the vast majority of people don't always understand it. Mm-hmm. And they get what they want out of it, but yet those who are going to look deeper into the film will get a deeper meaning out of it. And I think those are some of the most brilliant films. And I think a lot of the films that we're talking about here are the same thing. I mean, you can go all the way back to Scarface. Who's the real hero in Scarface? I mean, who would you say? And that kind of helps define how you watched that movie. And that makes it utterly brilliant. And there's no real right or wrong, but maybe what was intended is not what you're seeing.
Do you think Taxi Driver, was Taxi Driver a big hit at the time, or was that something that became a cult classic and has grown over time? Its reputation, the performance, the writing, the acting.
Commercially, it was. I mean, the budget was $1.9 million, but it did $28.4 at the box office. So by every stretch, based on budget, that's a win.
Man, let's talk about that film.
The films that I think are the most brilliant, and the reason why the filmmakers that do stuff like Fight Club, where you can look at it one way for what it is, being just fed to you, and you enjoy it, or you can actually go back and dissect everything and go back and really think about it and go deeper in the meaning. You know, films that allow you to watch it on a surface level or from a deeper perspective and meaning, those are the films that I think are going to stand the test of time.
What you're describing is nuance and subtlety and diverting expectations. Remember, we're coming off of, several decades before this, of the studio system and the Hollywood code of conduct. Essentially, the bad guy always had to be punished. You don't hurt kids on film. They're always the bad guy. You need to learn the lesson of crime and murder and all of these things. The bad guy, Jimmy Cagney will get shot at the end or put to death or whatever. And then starting in about the 60s with say a Bonnie and Clyde, it was okay to start doing the anti-hero. And then in the 70s, we get a Clockwork Orange. And then to your point, Taxi Driver, 76, Who is we know who the POV character is, but who is the good guy? Same thing, with the Clockwork Orange. It's like your point of view character is a legit head, is a rapist, murderer, but through that character, you see the subtleties. There are no clear answers. Nobody's pure evil. Nobody's good. Society itself is evil, brainwashing people and taking away their humanity, essentially. And I think Taxi Driver is the next step of that.
So that brings me to my next question, which really is, okay, some of the most amazing, iconic filmmakers that all came out in the 70s, but these are the same people who are talked about today and making movies and television. There's been a few breakout filmmakers that have come out, in the 80s, but I can't think of many in the post 2000. There's not many. So what we are getting the stories told from the same people for 40 years.
And there's 3 times as many movies coming out a year.
Correct. But they're getting all the love still. I'm not saying I don't love their content, but at what point does the torch pass?
Well, there's 2 things I'll throw into there. One, film is effectively, Guy, I apologize if my numbers are off. It's like, I think film's 130 years old. Really not that long. Okay, it really isn't that long. So it's evolving. So anything that evolves from an animal, it's always going to come into this painful stage where it needs to suddenly evolve and change because it's just not going to happen. It's not going to work anymore, and it's painful as hell. And we've seen a couple of those mini revolutions and changes and evolutions in film, both revolutions, literally, and evolutions. Things have changed. We've had things like experimental films, primarily in the 50s and 60s, where you have Brechtian films where people are like, okay, so my entire concept of my film is to make you hate it in every single possible way that a person can hate a film. Right. And they're meant to offend you and craze you and sometimes even make you sick or puke, or Andy Warhol's were hey, we're going to shoot the Empire State Building for 24 hours. And the best thing that happens in the movie is when the sun comes up, and people stood up and cheered because they sat in the movie theater for, 18 hours waiting for that one moment to happen. So when you have the 70s, and 80s, and you got all these prolific filmmakers changing the way things are. Now, again, we've hit the internet. We've hit the age of where I can watch any movie I want to. But try that in the 60s. Because the 80s, I think the 70s and the 80s were very similar filmmaking-wise, but the 90s was just like, okay, we're going in a totally different direction. And I think we've kind of been going in that direction ever since. You know, now they're really fun because they're escapist. And I think that movies became way more escapist and less of a thing about educational thing. And now that you have the internet, you can have access to watch any of it. I mean, you can just go, hey man, like it used to be like, hey, I've got a copy of Taxi Driver or Bambi. What do you want to watch? Because like that's all you got, right? And based on who your audience is, you're going to either go with Bambi full on or you go on Taxi Driver full on. You couldn't be like, well, I want to watch Predator. Okay, I have Taxi Driver and Bambi. Now you can be like, dude, I have access to 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 movies. And I could watch 5 minutes and go, you know, I don't want to watch that. I'm going to click it up and I'm going to switch into something
we just have access to everything. I mean, it's all just right there. And I think that's why there's no appreciation for art anymore. You know, when you're not having to pay money or having to go out of your way to like flip through rack after rack of CDs and spend that 12, 16, whatever bucks to bring it home, or that movie, you know, you're really invested, for better or worse. You're gonna watch or listen to the whole thing. Today, there's just such a lack of appreciation for the value of art because we don't have to invest time or money into it anymore.
The point you're both making, and I completely agree with you, is that film is more of a product now and less of an art. It used to be art. We are talking about films from the 60s and 70s that were straight up groundbreaking, artistic pieces of cultural work. And now, of those 500-something movies, a very slight handful are art, and the rest of it is a product appealing to the lowest common denominator and international audiences. Everybody understands what an explosion is, and it doesn't matter what language you speak. We are losing the art form.
But here's, oddly enough, I'm going to kind of disagree with you here. All right, so here's the deal. Andy Warhol. Love the guy or hate the guy, but he turned art into consumable stuff for people to consume, you know, to make it easy for anybody to get into. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're in the Andy Warhol phase of film, where everything is still artistic and crazy and really hard to do and brilliant and creative, but it's meant to be easily consumable. And that's where I'm saying at some point you're going to see that revolution change, where people are going to want things a little deeper. They're still there. They're always going to be there, the art films. But now they'll eventually come back. People are going to want more intellectual. But intellectual is not real popular right now, so we'll see how that goes.
Intellectual's not real popular right now. I love it.